Good evening. I'm Deborah Olashansky, Community Relations Director for the Jewish Federation and Jewish Foundation of Nashville and Tennessee. On behalf of our co-host, Nashville Jewish Social Justice Roundtable, and all of our supporting sponsors, thank you for making time to join us. 3 years ago, neo-Nazis and white supremacists descended on Charlottesville, Virginia, marching and chanting, "Jews will not replace us," and setting off a weekend of violence. This violence was no accident. Rather, it was the result of months of planning, and it previewed the extremist terror that has followed. Integrity First for America, in partnership with world-class legal team, is uniquely taking on individuals and hate groups at the center of this violent movement, holding them accountable in federal court for the violence they brought to Charlottesville. Eric Ward, the nationally recognized expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements and hate violence, writes, "Anti-Semitism is the particular and potent form of racism so central to white supremacy that Black people could not win our freedom without tearing it down. The anti-Semitism at the foundation of white supremacy is why we in the Jewish community wanted to bring this program to you this evening. We are so grateful to all of our ongoing partnerships with all of our sponsor groups who helped to promote this event this evening. And it gives me hope that our bonds will support us in the work to end violent hate crimes and pursue justice and inclusive democracy. We are so fortunate to have journalist John Siegenthaler and IFA Executive Director Amy Spatonik with us this evening. John Siegenthaler is known for his award-winning work as a journalist for NBC News. He was the anchor of the NBC Nightly News Weekend Edition for more than a decade. He anchored programs on MSNBC and CNBC and appeared on the Today Show, Dateline, and Meet the Press. He is currently a partner with the global communications firm Finn Partners. The Siegenthaler Pedestrian Bridge in Nashville is named for his father in honor of his courage and his dedication to the causes of civil rights, community building, and inclusion. Amy Spatonik, Executive Director of Integrity First for America, the nonpartisan civil rights nonprofit backing the landmark federal lawsuit filed by a coalition of Charlottesville community members against the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for the August 2017 violence. Amy joins IFA with extensive experience in government politics, including serving as communications director and senior policy advisor for the New York Attorney General, communications advisor and spokesperson for the New York City Mayor, and communications director in the New York State Senate. We are so grateful to have both John and Amy here with us. Welcome. The screen is yours.
Deborah, thank you for that kind introduction, and welcome to all of you, especially Amy, for being our guest here tonight. And Amy, I'm honored to meet you and really excited about hearing the work that you're doing. Let me just start with, what is Integrity First for America?
Well, thank you so much, John, for doing this, and Deborah and Avi and all the incredible sponsors of tonight's event. I wish I could be there with you in person in Nashville. I'm looking forward to the time that I can come out there, hopefully after our trial. When we win, we can celebrate in person, but for now, virtual will have to do, and I'm grateful for everyone taking the time out of their evenings to learn about this. Integrity First for America is a small civil rights nonprofit. We were founded in 2017, recognizing that there was likely to be a very large gap in the civil rights enforcement work that was so critical to what our federal government typically did. And with the then Jeff Sessions DOJ in place, it was apparent that there might be a vacuum that would need to be filled when it came to public interest litigation, the sorts of work that has become so critical to advancing the civil rights of Americans. And very quickly, Charlottesville happened in August of 2017. And it was very clear as soon as that violence unfolded that there needed to be accountability, that there needed to be justice, and that with the federal government that was in place at the time, it was unlikely that there would have been that robust level of accountability that we believe needed to be seen. And so we, working with a coalition of Charlottesville community members and an incredible legal team, have brought a lawsuit, which is what we're here to talk about tonight, And before we dive into the conversation, I want to share my screen to show a quick 2-minute video that will bring us back to Charlottesville 3.5 years ago. I do like to warn folks that, of course, given the topic at hand, there are some disturbing sounds and images in this video. It includes footage of what happened in Charlottesville in August of 2017. So I do want to warn people about that before I press play. I'm going to share my screen now, and then after the video, we can dive into this discussion.
Terror in Charlottesville. Stark displays of racism.
Trying to promote my car has rammed into a crowd.
Victims thrown in the air. React to domestic terror. One woman dead, others
10 of the people who were injured in Charlottesville, including 3 of the people who were hit by that car and survived, have now brought a lawsuit against not only the murderer who drove his vehicle into the crowd, but also the leaders of all of the white nationalist groups that organized and promoted the Charlottesville event.
We are Integrity First for America. We are here to disrupt the extremism, to interrupt the cycle, to dismantle and bankrupt these hate groups and their leaders, to put them out of business, and most importantly, to stop the violence. Integrity First for America is leading the fight against white supremacy. Our Charlottesville lawsuit is the only current legal effort taking on the broad leadership of this movement, holding white supremacists accountable for their premeditated violence. We know that it's working. They're already facing huge financial and legal consequences. But we also know what we're up against. Bankrupting Nazis isn't cheap. These groups are still recruiting, weaponizing fear, and preparing for their next attack. Now more than ever, we are reminded of our obligation to dismantle the systems of white supremacy that poison this country. Turn your outrage into action, because hate has no place here.
Some powerful images. When I look at that video, and I looked at it before we talked, you say disrupting the extremism, bankrupting the hate groups, putting them out of business, stopping the violence. At this time in our lives, given what we're seeing on television almost every day and reading in the newspaper, how do you do that?
Well, it's so important to understand what happened in Charlottesville 3.5 years ago and how this violence unfolded, because it was not an accident, but rather it was a result of meticulous planning for months in advance. And so by going after the groups and the leaders who are at the center of that conspiracy, which is what our case is, it's a conspiracy case, we know that we can have a major financial, legal, and operational impact on them, and also create a model for what accountability could look like at a time when it's so desperately needed. And so to take us back 3 years ago, I think it's so easy to forget that neo-Nazis and white supremacists attacked an American city and chanting things like "Jews will not replace us" and "White Lives Matter," blood and soil, hearkening back to the darkest days of both Jewish history and I think human history in many ways. First, on Friday, August 11th, carrying tiki torches, which were meant to evoke the KKK and the Nazis. These white supremacists descended on the University of Virginia. They chanted, again, "Jews will not replace us," blood and soil. They surrounded a small group of peaceful counter-protesters at the Thomas Jefferson statue. They kicked them, punched them, beat them up, threw lit torches and fuel at them. One of our plaintiffs who was there that evening, an African-American undergrad at the university, said he thought he was going to die. And nearby, an interfaith gathering had come together to create a safe space for the community, knowing that white supremacists were coming to town. And ironically, they had to shelter in place because it was so unsafe outside the doors. The next day, Saturday, August 12th, was sadly no different in terms of the violence. I think we all know how the day ended with the car attack that has become so well known that claimed Heather Heyer's life and injured many, including our plaintiffs. But it was truly a day and a weekend of violence. It was a Saturday, so it was a Shabbat, and the synagogue in downtown Charlottesville was celebrating. And the neo-Nazis decided to march around the synagogue, chanting things like Sieg Heil, carrying semi-automatic weapons. In their online chats, they were talking about, quote, torching those Jewish monsters. And the synagogue had to evacuate people and Torah scrolls out the back. And the detail that gets me every time, no matter how much I hear it, is that the synagogue was home to a Torah scroll that had been saved from Nazi Germany decades ago. And somehow in America in 2017, it was once again under Nazi threat. And that detail sort of, I feel it in my gut and my throat every time I share that story, because it's so indicative of what's at stake here. The violence continued throughout the day. They charged a line of interfaith clergy who were peacefully counter-protesting. And the day culminated in a car attack in which James Fields drove his car into a crowd of peaceful counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer, injuring many others, including our plaintiffs. In that video, you saw a number of our plaintiffs, including Marcus Martin, who's the African-American man sprawled across the back of the car in that Pulitzer-winning photo of the attack. His then fiance, now wife Marissa, had just been pushed out of the way. Natalie Romero, whose skull was fractured in the attack, and you saw her with blood dripping down her face. Thomas Baker, who's flipping over the hood of the car. Our plaintiffs are a coalition of Charlottesville community members who were really grievously injured across the weekend. And what's so important to understand here is that nothing that happened on Friday or on Saturday was an accident, but rather the result of meticulous planning in social media chats for months in advance, in which these extremists discussed every detail down to discussions of hitting protesters with cars. So you asked how we can bankrupt and dismantle these groups. What happened in Charlottesville wasn't an accident. It was a racist, violent conspiracy, and we have laws that protect against that. And so using those laws on behalf of our coalition of plaintiffs, we're taking to court the 24 individuals and hate groups directly responsible for orchestrating the violence.
And you said you allege a conspiracy. Tell me what that conspiracy is.
So our suit uses a number of civil rights statutes, but the one that is most notable and I think interesting is something called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. And this is a law that was first passed 150 years ago, actually exactly 150 years ago, to protect recently freed slaves from Klan violence in the South. When after the Civil War, Klansmen would use violence to terrorize recently freed slaves and try to scare them into not using their recently won 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment rights. And so it's one of the few laws in our country that particularly give private citizens a right of recourse against other private citizens when it comes to the abuse of their civil rights. So much of our civil rights law has to do with governmental conduct, the government's responsibility to protect our rights. This is a law that has to do with private citizens and their and holding them accountable for the abuse and conspiracies to undermine other American civil rights. It's been used a number of times since the Civil War, including during the early 1900s when the Klan was running rampant again, and during the Freedom Rider era. And we are using it in this case because, as I described, what happened in Charlottesville was planned for months in advance. In these social media chats, and these chats happen on a number of platforms, but most notably on a site called Discord, which some of you might know because it's a social media chat site that video gamers use to communicate with one another when they're playing a game. And on Discord, the organizers of Unite the Right had chats that included everything from the mundane and the banal. So when Hannah Arendt talked about the banality of evil, I think this is truly what she meant. They talked about what to wear. How do you best sew a swastika onto a flag? Will mayonnaise spoil in the sun? What's the best gluten-free bread to bring? Our team has sort of this joke, because you have to laugh about some of this, that when this is all over, we'll write a coffee table book called Things Nazis Also Say, because you have to sort of laugh at the banality of some of these conversations. But of course, the other chats were the vile and the violent. They talked about how they could use quote unquote free speech instruments like flagpoles to violently attack counter-protesters, and even whether they could hit protesters with cars and then claim self-defense, which is of course exactly what they did. And so in these social media chats, it's crystal clear that what happened was not an accident. It was not self-defense. It was not just speech, but rather it was a racist, violent conspiracy to attack people in Charlottesville based on their race, their religion, and their willingness to defend the rights of others. And so we are taking them to court with trials scheduled for this fall in Charlottesville for that racist violent conspiracy.
And if you prove your case, what happens?
So this is a civil case. We are, representing private plaintiffs. And as I mentioned earlier, it was very clear that the Department of Justice at the time, under Jeff Sessions and then Bill Barr, was unlikely to bring a case like this. Ironically, now, in the aftermath of the Capitol attack, which I'm sure we'll talk about, we're starting to see conspiracy cases against many of those responsible for the violence on January 6th. And so while I don't know if Charlottesville would have happened if there were a different administration in place in 2017, we certainly know that had there been a different DOJ in place, there might have been broader efforts for accountability. In lieu of the accountability from our government that I think was so desperately needed here, it really fell on private plaintiffs to act. And our case is the only legal effort in the country going after the broader leadership of those responsible for the violence in Charlottesville and who happen to be at the center of this broader movement. We, bringing a civil suit, can seek specific sorts of relief, most notably large financial judgments. And so when we talk about bankrupting and putting out of business these neo-Nazis, that's what we mean. But even before trial, it has been certainly a long road. We filed this suit in October of 2017, a couple months after the violence. We are now scheduled for trial in October of 2021, a full 4 years after we first filed suit. Justice has not been swift for a number of reasons, including the COVID pandemic delaying our trial a year. But even before trial, we have been aggressive in holding these extremists to account to their obligations under the lawsuit, their discovery obligations, the fact that they need to produce evidence and comply with court orders. And unsurprisingly, so many of them refuse to do so, have flouted court orders. It's probably not a surprise that neo-Nazis aren't the biggest adherents to the rule of law. And so when they flout those court orders, we're able to go after them with motions for sanctions, holding them in contempt of court, and making sure that they face consequences for violating what the court requires of them. And so even before trial, we've been able to enlarge financial sanctions, even had 2 of them have bench warrants issued for their arrest, with one sitting in jail last year. We've won evidentiary sanctions. And defendants like Richard Spencer, who's one of the country's leading neo-Nazis, has called our case financially crippling. And so we see how the accountability works even before we get to trial this fall. When we get to trial and win these large financial judgments against the defendants from a jury of Charlottesville and Virginia residents, which I think will be quite powerful, we'll be able to quite effectively bankrupt and dismantle them in a way that goes well beyond what we've even seen to date.
I want to ask a follow-up to that, but before I do, we're already getting a ton of questions, and I want to direct people to the Q&A button on the screen. You just roll your cursor over it and you can click on it and ask a question. And one of the natural questions that came right after you talked about Charlottesville was, have things changed since Charlottesville? Is the same meticulous planning that led up to Charlottesville, it appears very much like we've seen at the Capitol. How do you relate these 2 events?
Yeah, look, there's such a direct line that runs from Charlottesville to the Capitol. You can't look at what happened on January 6th and not see the stunning parallels with what happened in Charlottesville from how it was planned. And with each passing day, there's yet another, there are more charges being brought against these insurrectionists, in which their social media chats and the other planning is meticulously detailed in the same way that the planning happened in Charlottesville. Social media played a critical role in both attacks, allowing these extremists to connect and to plan violence in advance. They showed up with weapons, including with this idea of using quote unquote free speech instruments as weapons. A flagpole was used, for example, to beat a Capitol police officer at the Capitol, the same way that the Charlottesville neo-Nazis discussed using free speech instruments as weapons as well. And they showed up in tactical gear, prepared for a fight. Of course, at the core of both attacks was also a vile, violent white supremacy. Of course, Charlottesville was an attack rooted in this idea of anti-Semitism, racism, white supremacy, chanting things like "Jews will not replace us," which specifically speaks to this idea of replacement theory, that they're of white genocide, which I'm sure we'll get into. And similarly at the Capitol, there were Camp Auschwitz shirts and a noose hanging outside and Confederate flags, the most iconic Confederate images that you could, and white supremacist images you could imagine. And both of these ideas are really rooted in this concept of the country being stolen from white people. The white race being replaced by people of color, orchestrated by Jews, which is at the core of what happened in Charlottesville, and the election being stolen and a country being stolen from white people, which is what Stop the Steal referred to. And so I think there are so many alarming parallels in terms of the tools, the tactics, and the ideology that were at play. One thing that is notable, though, is that many of our Charlottesville defendants, while some of them were serving as, for example, cheerleaders to what happened at the Capitol, and there were some Charlottesville attendees who also were part of the Capitol insurrection, a number of our Charlottesville defendants who you would have expected to see there, like Richard Spencer and others, were nowhere to be seen. And that's because in our case, they have faced severe accountability for the violence that they brought to Charlottesville 3.5 years ago. And the impacts of that litigation of our case has financially crippled them, to quote Richard Spencer, and pushed many of them to the margins of this movement. And it shows us that accountability works. And if we had this sort of accountability on a broader scale, perhaps a few years ago, I'm not sure if the Capitol attack would have happened.
I mean, as you know, the discussion about the First Amendment and free speech is one that's sort of at the center of this discussion. And I know that these disgusting, horrible, hateful comments that are made by racists and anti-Semites claim that the First Amendment protects them when they say it. So what is it that pushes it over the edge? I mean, hate speech is often allowed in this country because of the First Amendment. How do you stop the hate and the violence without stopping the hate speech?
Yeah. It's a great question, and it's one that we think our case really effectively details how you take on extremism without undermining our First Amendment rights. And we've been heartened that, for example, the former presidents of the ACLU and others have said as much, in addition to the judge in our case, who made clear in his decision rejecting the defendant's motions to dismiss, that the First Amendment does not protect violence. And so if these neo-Nazis had gone to Charlottesville and simply stood there with their swastikas and their hate speech and their chants and their ugly slogans and bigotry, it would have been protected. They would have had every right to do that. And while I find their beliefs abhorrent and disgusting, I would have agreed that they had a right to be there doing so. But that's not what they did. What they did was plan a weekend of violence in those social media chats and elsewhere, and then go to Charlottesville and commit that violence, culminating in Heather Heyer's death and the injury of our plaintiffs. And that's not protected by speech, the same way that if you and I conspired here or in text message or on email to rob a bank, and then we went and robbed that bank, it wouldn't be protected. And so that's what's the difference here. The difference is that this is not a speech case, but it's a conspiracy case seeking to hold accountable these extremists, not just for their beliefs and their words, but for the actions that were the culmination of those conversations.
You know, people are asking a lot of questions, so I'm just going to weave some of these in as quickly as I can so we can get to them. Louise Brock asks, who are the lawyers who defend these people?
A fascinating question. Some of them are representing themselves, which has been a challenge because, as I mentioned earlier, they are not the most compliant with court orders. And when they are representing themselves, that is an even bigger challenge for our legal team. And some of them are represented sort of in pockets by a few different lawyers, most notably someone who bills himself as quite literally Nazi lawyer and says that he has taken on this case to deal with the problem of Jewish influence in our society. So you can get a sense of sort of the ideology at play. The irony here is that in some cases, the defendants have been too extreme even for lawyers like that. And so we had, for example, one defendant who was directly threatening one of our attorneys, talking about all the fun he was going to have with her when this was over. And his attorney moved to remove himself from representing this defendant, saying that the conduct was, quote, too repugnant, even for him. And so it really gives you a sense of just how horrendous and horrific some of these defendants are, the lengths that they go to use harassment and threats to try to scare us into not holding them accountable, and even sort of attorneys who come at this from a very specific ideological perspective, still finding them, quote, too repugnant to represent them. On our side, of course, we have a fantastic team of pro bono attorneys led by Roberta Kaplan, who represented Edie Windsor in the marriage equality case at the Supreme Court, and Karen Dunn, who's a former federal prosecutor in Virginia, and a fantastic team. And we are just so lucky to have these attorneys representing our plaintiffs and working with us to move this case across the finish line. The fact that they are continuing to sort of power through despite the harassment and threats being thrown at them and us and our plaintiffs from the other side is, I think, a testament to how incredible they are.
Yeah, Phyllis McCormick asked, do these groups have money? I mean, you said it could be financially crippling. How much money have they got?
So some of these individuals and groups do have money. And what's important to understand is that also what happened in Charlottesville clearly was funded in some way. The matching uniforms, the tiki torches, the fact that they drove these matching white Mercedes vans around the Black neighborhoods in Charlottesville intentionally to intimidate residents. There was money behind that. And so while our plaintiffs have not gone into this expecting to win millions upon millions of dollars immediately, there was money in Charlottesville in terms of what funding this conspiracy. And we believe our case is the best opportunity to get to the bottom of that money. But it also means that for the rest of our defendants' lives, we will be following them around to collect on the judgments that we win from the jury at trial. And that's so important. It means we'll put a lien on their home, we'll garnish their wages, we'll seize any assets they have. And that is how a case like this can have such important financial and operational impacts on the defendants themselves, and also really serve as a deterrent to others who are considering being part of this sort of violence.
Amy, you talked about this a little bit, but why don't prosecutors focus on this? Why aren't they taking on these groups in criminal court?
Well, we are in a new era when it comes to the federal government. And so our hope is that the federal government will start making this a priority. And the signals we've seen over the last few weeks have suggested as much, both in terms of what the Biden administration will do in terms of assessing this threat and taking action more broadly across the scope of the federal government, but also specifically the Department of Justice, which has already brought some initial smaller conspiracy cases against the Proud Boys and other insurrectionists. And we believe they could truly bring a broader conspiracy case along the lines of what we've done here. If we have, as a small nonprofit, could financially cripple neo-Nazis like Richard Spencer and have such a major financial and operational impact on the leaders of this movement through our little civil suit, imagine what the Department of Justice could do if it used the tools it has at its disposal, civilly and criminally, to hold these extremists to account. And so we're optimistic about what we see coming out of this administration, and really hope that our case serves as both a model and as validation that this strategy works.
I have to ask you about social media, because you brought that up as well. I covered Klan rallies and events, violent events aimed at synagogues in the South and in other parts of the country. I really wonder whether or not you think this has always been beneath the surface and is just coming out, or has social media made this worse?
I think the answer is both, in that there's always been white supremacy and racism and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and hate in this country. I think we know that. Everyone watching this probably knows that and has experienced it in various forms over their lifetimes. But what social media has allowed these extremists to do is, instead of being relegated to their specific regions and communities, where in the past Klansmen would meet in their white hoods in the woods somewhere, and their hate would be limited to their geographic area. Now, with social media, they can connect not just across the region, not just across the country, but around the globe. And using social media, organize, inspire, conspire, as we saw in Charlottesville, And what's so important to understand is that these attacks aren't isolated. Charlottesville wasn't an isolated incident. None of these attacks were isolated incidents. We know, for example, that the Pittsburgh shooter communicated with the Charlottesville leader on Gab, which is a far-right social media site, and before he killed 11 Jews praying in synagogue 2.5 years ago. The Christchurch shooter who killed dozens of Muslims praying in mosque in New Zealand 2 years ago was a big fan of a number of our Charlottesville defendants online and gave them money online and even painted onto his gun a white power symbol that was first popularized by one of our defendants. And he in turn live streamed the attack in Christchurch, which inspired the Poway attack at the Chabad in California 2 years ago and the El Paso attack at the Walmart in Texas. And so you see how this cycle of violence works and that each attack is used online to inspire the next one. And social media has played such a crucial role in allowing that to happen so that we're dealing with a threat that isn't just regional, but is national and global in its nature. And so any solution here needs to include making sure social media companies are not giving a platform to this hate and to this extremism.
Let me bring a couple of others into this conversation and remind all of you who are watching, and thank you for joining, that we're going to get to more of your questions. But the Reverend Davy Tucker is with us from the American Baptist College, and Sabina Moyedin is the Executive Director of the American Muslim Advisory Council. Welcome to both of you. Reverend Tucker, just give me your reaction to what Amy's talking about and Integrity First and its mission.
Well, I hope that they're successful. And while I can appreciate the title from Charlottesville to Capitol Hill, from where I sit, there's a longer line, the unresolved issue of the Civil War. That when at the Capitol, when I witnessed the individual carrying the Confederate battle flag, it was clear that even after the Civil War, America has never dealt with this issue around race. So this creates a great moment with the lawsuit that's going on, with what just happened, that Abraham Heschel said, indifference is worse than evil. And so this calls a moment for us not to be indifferent, that there have been those who have lived in the fear of rape and pillage, and this has been real to us always. I always knew that even though this group aspires to be pro-police, you see what happened when it came down to the threat to their idea of what whiteness is going to be in America. That this is a time where if you ever were going to pick a side, you must pick one now. For the fear that people are experiencing now, many have been indifferent to it. So here now you see it. This is out, it's out and ugly, but for many folks, we live it every day. My son has a brand new car and it took too long for them to get the license tags. So I had to go to the dealership, and before I knew it, I was telling them why I'm so upset, is that I have a 24-year-old Black boy riding in a new car, which is an automatic reason for the police to stop him. Racism permeates our environment. Some of us are able to live free of it, even when we're subjects of it. So it's going to take the collective good of all of us to come to bear on this situation.
Sabina, when I think about what's happened at Charlottesville and at the Capitol, and how this hatred has really come to light in the last few years, I think about Muslims who've endured this in our country for a very long time, especially since 9/11. Can you give me your reaction to this effort that Integrity First has launched?
Yes. So, everyone doesn't always make the connection that Islamophobia, anti-Muslim racism isn't just another part of white supremacy. And sometimes people think, well, if we have dialogue, if people just knew Muslims a little better, that would solve the problem. But in the last 2 decades, Islamophobia has grown into $1 billion industry worldwide. It's a network of paid speakers, authors, so-called experts and advisors and career politicians who benefit financially from targeting Muslims. So, you know, here in Tennessee, we have our own Islamophobes who benefit. And we have Lori Cardozo Moore, whose organization Proclaiming Justice to the Nations financed the lawsuit against the building of the Islamic Center of Murfreesboro. And she was recently appointed to the Tennessee Textbook Commission. We have others like Kathy Henners, who has a Blogspot, Daily Roll Call, and then she has books, and you have Bill Fringe selling books on political Islam. They're going to rural Tennessee to places where people have never met a Muslim, and filling their minds with misinformation, right? And you know, taking a step back from like the work Amy is doing, holding people accountable once, you know, the rallies and the violence happens. You know, I would love to, you know, get ideas. How do we stop when we know who these players are? How do we go after them before the violence happens? You know, what are steps we can take when we know that people are targeting our communities?
That's a question that was asked by one of the watchers, one of our viewers here, who said, how do we change the mindset? And I'd add to that, I mean, how do we change a society that has been saying, I suspect, for a while, well, that's just a small group of people, and, you know, we just need to ignore that for a while and it'll go away. What do you say to that, Amy?
We can't ignore it because every single community represented here tonight, our fates are so intrinsically intertwined here, in that you can't take on white supremacy without taking on Islamophobia. You can't take on white supremacy without taking on anti-Semitism. You can't take on racism without taking on any of these other forms of hate. And I mentioned earlier replacement theory, which is the ideology that motivates so much of this extremism that we've seen. And this is something that percolates to the surface when you see horrific attacks like the ones I mentioned, Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, Christchurch, Poway, El Paso. It sort of manifests in this very explicit form where you hear them chanting things like Jews will not replace us. And this is the idea that Jews are the puppet masters orchestrating the replacement of the white race, supporting Muslim Americans, supporting Black Americans and the Latinx community and the LGBTQ community and immigrants and refugees and anyone who doesn't fit into the vile, narrow vision for what these white supremacists want this country to be. And so you see it in these very explicit and egregious terms when it happens in the form of those attacks. But this is also an ideology that we see manifesting increasingly in the mainstream of the right in a variety of ways. And so when you hear dog whistles like George Soros supporting the Black Lives Matter protests, or supporting a caravan coming up through Central America, or any of the other dog whistles that we hear from increasingly mainstream Republicans and other leaders, that is the same white supremacist ideology that ultimately culminates in the sorts of egregious violent attacks we're talking about here. And so we need to recognize how deeply intertwined all of our communities' fates are here, that you can't take on one form of hate without taking on all of them, because they are at the core of this white supremacy that is poisoning our country, that is not new, as Reverend Tucker mentioned, but that has really become especially emboldened in this particularly violent way over the last few years because of some of the factors that we're talking about. And so recognizing that instead of pitting communities against one another, we should be recognizing that our fates are intertwined. And then making sure that there is swift justice and accountability for those responsible for this sort of hate and violence, which is what we seek to do through our lawsuit.
Rose Lundberg asked this. She says, I think the refusal to accept the 2020 election results is like the South not willing to admit defeat in the Civil War. And I think that the latter has led to the former. Reverend Tucker, what do you say about that?
Oh, I totally agree. And from where I said, if you just recall, for decades, our concern about the Confederate flag, what that symbolizes to us, what it means was never given the attention by those in power that it should have. It was clear what it meant to us, that it was a threat to us. So even as that person says, and I agree, is that there was indifference on the part of the larger white community. Some said, well, that's our heritage, that's our history, and that's our forefathers. But this symbol kept alive, just as these monuments, they keep alive for folk, and it's a constant dog whistle. And so that has been accepted by such a significant portion of the mainline society. These images for some of us that will always be racist at their core, it's disheartening for us when generally people of goodwill don't want to see it from our perspective. And that's just like Sabina. I don't have to be Muslim to understand from her perspective of what she's going to. I am a Christian, but if I have space to be this Christian, she needs to have space to practice Islam. But there are people who attach American with this demented idea of Christianity, that if you don't watch this idea of Christianity, it is racist. And if you just look at what so many of the evangelical leaders have said publicly, from Franklin Graham on, that is racist at its core. When they buy into these lines, when they show up with these people, Governor Lee's pastor was there that day and said he was there to pray and preach. I mean, if we don't see it for what it is, even when we don't want to look at it, we need to force our eyes to keep looking at it and acknowledge it. And that's the only way we can even formulate a way.
And I'm gonna turn back to you in just a second, Amy, but I want to ask you this, Sabina. It looks like from the groups that we have represented here tonight that we're all stronger together. And yet sometimes we haven't always been able to get together and fight in such a way. And this seems like a turning point. Do you see it that way?
Oh, absolutely. I think, like I guess many others have said, this is about the soul of our country, and this is about how we all fit in and we move forward. Obviously, white supremacy didn't start with President Trump, but it has just come front and center in our face. And many of us are ready to see a different nation come out of this, a better one. But it again, like Amy said, you're not going to be able to solve one aspect of white supremacy without solving the other. And this is something I always talk about. It's easy as a Muslim being more sensitive to when things happen against our community, but realizing if I'm not, working on anti-Semitism and speaking out forcefully and immediately on anti-Semitism, who am I to be complaining about Islamophobia? Same thing with anti-Black racism. If I'm not speaking out forcefully and doing something about it, then what is my issue? Where does it have any meaning? So we have to work together, and we have to, let's say, squash the haters out there, the white supremacies, the minute they raise their head. And the challenging part of it is, it's like a lot of times our ideas of white supremacy and white supremacists they're ignorant, backwards, but we saw with January 6th, there were doctors and lawyers, CEOs there. And so understanding how pervasive it is and how we got to go back to the companies we work in and to the business, where we do business with, who we do business with, and ask, okay, what are you doing? And how do we work together to build a better country?
These are important comments. Reverend Tucker and Sabina, I want to thank you for everything you do for the community, and thanks for joining us tonight. I want to turn on to Amy and continue this conversation. It really follows up what I hear from Ron Siegel, and he asked this question. While I think these legal actions will be helpful, they're just Band-Aids. Why are there no discussions on addressing the underlying driver, the mindset or education of these haters? Take away their money, there will still be haters who will do their damage as smaller groups. A start might be to make it mandatory for grade school students to read one of the biographies of Frederick Douglass. But give us your sense of, is this just a Band-Aid?
I don't think it's a Band-Aid. I think I'll say a few things here. I think one, accountability matters. There will always be racists. There will always be white supremacists. There will always be extremists. And we are never going to fully eradicate hate. Maybe I'm cynical. Maybe I've been doing this sort of work too long. I don't think we're going to fully eradicate hate, but we can push it back underground where it belongs by making clear there are very severe consequences for being part of these racist, violent conspiracies. And we see that working. We see the crippling impact our suit has had on some of our defendants in keeping them away from actions like January 6th. And if this is done at a broader scale, it will have much more severe impacts on this broader movement. But it's not a silver bullet. I'll say it's not a Band-Aid, but it's also not a silver bullet. There needs to be much broader work on so many different fronts. It includes the education front. Year after year, there's horrible statistics that come out, for example, from the Claims Conference about how the vast majority of people under, I think, 30 don't even know what Auschwitz is. And so education, making sure that we are actually teaching kids about white supremacy, about the reality of our country's history and its roots in white supremacy, about the Holocaust, about how Muslims were treated after 9/11, making sure that we are actually incorporating this into what we teach so that we can learn from history and not repeat it.
You touched on this, but one of the questions from my friend Sally Levine says, what type of similarities do you see between the rise of white supremacy and the rise of Nazism in Germany?
So, there's so much to say here. I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And so I think a lot about this question. My grandparents were fortunate to survive barely. Their entire families were wiped out by the Nazis. And it's so easy right now to look at the parallels with what happened then and what's happening now and think about the darkest times in our history. But here's the difference. Unlike my grandparents' generation, we live in a country where we have a rule of law. We have a justice system. And while we've had to fight like crazy to protect it over the last few years, we have these tools and we can use them to take action against these extremists and bring them to justice for the violence and the racism and the hate that they've perpetrated. And so that's a major difference. And in so many ways, this is a heavy topic. This is a topic that you could oftentimes feel frustrated and even helpless on, but that gives me hope. And that makes me optimistic that we can use the tools we have in this country to bring these extremists to account. And as I said, it's not a silver bullet. There's so much more that needs to happen in terms of governmental action on the local, state, and federal level, in terms of the private sector and social media companies, in terms of education, in terms of supporting de-radicalization efforts. But using our justice system, we have the opportunity to make a significant dent in how these extremists operate and send a very clear message, both in terms of the accountability and justice these specific defendants will face and the deterrent effect it will have on others. And so that gives me hope and optimism in a way that, it's easy to feel helpless and hopeless thinking about the parallels with our history.
Sadly, by taking on this work, you make yourself a target. And people who stand up make themselves targets when they're fighting this fight. And tell me a little bit about that. I mean, do you worry about your own safety and the safety of those you work with?
Yeah, so to be completely frank, the biggest item in IFA's budget is security. Our legal work is pro bono. There's, of course, other expenses related to this case, but when we raise money for IFA, it directly funds, in particular, security to keep our team safe, our lawyers safe, our plaintiffs and our expert witnesses safe, because these defendants and their supporters have used threats and harassment as a means to try to scare us into not holding them accountable. In some cases, it's direct threats by the defendants. I think I mentioned earlier, one of our defendants talked about all the fun he was going to have with us when this is over. In some cases, it's about their own capacity for violence. We know that these are people with large capacities for violence. We saw it in Charlottesville and elsewhere. But even more so, it's about their ability to rile their loyal followers to action and encourage their followers to harass, to threaten, and to take violent action against us and others involved in this case. And so that means we have to be careful when it comes to security, in terms of monitoring the threats we have, in terms of making sure our team is protected when we go to trial in Charlottesville this fall. And so for folks who are able to support this case financially, you should know that your donations directly support the litigation.
Well, that's going to lead to the question from Judith Hahn, who asks, how can I help? Excellent
question, Judith. So there's so much that people can do on this topic. First and foremost, in terms of Integrity First for America itself, if you have the ability to donate, every dollar directly supports this case. We are a 501c3, so it's also tax deductible. So you can donate. I believe we put the link in the chat just now, integrityfirstforamerica.org. And you should know that those donations directly fund security and other vital case needs like evidence collection, scraping the evidence off of the defendant's devices and the social media accounts and so on. And they truly make this case possible and keep our team safe in bringing this across the finish line, but also spread the word. It is so easy to feel helpless and frustrated and scared in this moment. I know I do at times. It's not unreasonable to feel that way. This is a concrete, tangible thing that you can do, that you can get involved with, that provides a direct way to fight back against the white supremacy and hate that's poisoning this country. So let people know this is happening. Share this on your social media. If you want to bring a virtual program to your community, reach out to us on our website. There's so much that you could do to spread the word. And more broadly, note that this is an issue that requires our full attention and our full resources, and don't let it fall off the radar screen. Hold your elected officials to account, hold social media companies to account, and keep ringing the alarm bells even when this falls out of the news cycle.
It's a really important point. So tell me practically, not only if you win this case, then what will happen, not just to the defendants, but what do you hope what sort of movement do you hope to start?
Yeah, I'd say there are three things that we hope to come out of this case. First and foremost is justice for Charlottesville and our plaintiffs and accountability for the defendants. There's been such a stunning lack of accountability in the aftermath of Charlottesville, and more broadly when it comes to the far-right extremism we've seen on the rise in recent years. And we know that this is a crisis. The Department of Homeland Security called it the most persistent and lethal threat facing our country. The FBI said hate crimes hit record levels in 2019. We are dealing with a crisis of far-right extremism in this country, and there has been such little accountability. And so ensuring that level of accountability for our defendants is crucial, and winning justice for our plaintiffs. So that's one. Two is the ability to truly disrupt, dismantle, and bankrupt these groups. We've talked about this already in some forms. We've seen the impact even before trial through the sanctions we've won, the jail time, the evidentiary sanctions we won. And when we win these large judgments at trial, we can truly effectively dismantle and bankrupt these groups and these leaders in a way that will have major impacts, especially given how central they are to this broader movement. And three is something that might be a little bit more intangible, if you will, but I think so important. Every decade or so in this country, there is a trial that is about more than the trial and more than the parties itself, but is a moment of public reckoning on a topic that we as a country so desperately need. And you can look at the Prop 8 case on marriage equality in California almost a decade ago. You can go back to Scopes Monkey, so many other cases, Brown v. Board of Ed, that have really been sort of touchstones in the progress of this nation. And we believe that this case can be that trial. We are going to trial in Charlottesville, blocks away from Heather Heyer Way, where the violence unfolded. A jury of Charlottesville residents and Virginia residents are going to hold accountable these extremists for the violence that they brought to their community. And this trial, which will take place over 4 weeks in Charlottesville, and I suspect receive a good amount of attention from the national media, can really help serve as that sort of public touchstone, that public reckoning that we must continue to have on this crisis of extremism. January 6th helped. The Black Lives Matter protests last summer were critical in raising awareness about the lack of justice. But there's so much more that this country needs to understand about this crisis. And we hope this trial can play a critical role in laying bare how these groups operate and the violence and bigotry at their core.
You described it. It is very personal for so many people, for you, for all of us. And I get this question from Peggy Orange, and she says, I have family and friends who have fallen into white supremacy. Please suggest words I can use to help them see what they're doing. I'm often just speechless. And I do think that we all have experiences that continue to be more and more frightening. What do you say to people?
Look, I think we need to recognize that what we want this country to be and who this country is supposed to represent. And I think it's easy to feel like there are so many white supremacists and so many extremists and so many conspiracists who are sort of overtaking our country right now. But I truly believe that there are so many more of us than there are of them. What we need to do is provide the off-ramps for people who are savable, people that we can de-radicalize and bring out of this movement, which we can do through both direct programming, and there are incredible resources like groups like Life After Hate and others that do incredible work helping people de-radicalize and giving them an off-ramp from extremism. And I would encourage people to check that out if they have friends and family who are getting caught up in some of these groups. We need to have empathy in doing so, particularly when you look at some of the conspiracy theories and extremism that has sort of percolated to the surface over recent years, recognizing that we can help bring our friends and family out of this with some empathy to the extent possible. But it also means when they cross that line that there needs to be accountability. And that's what our suit is about for those who take that step and are part of violent acts, which really serve as an important deterrent and a wake-up call to many who are caught up in this movement by making clear the consequences for the hate and the violence that they perpetrate. And so it really needs to be this comprehensive approach if we're going to pull ourselves out of this crisis that we're grappling with. It's not a single tool in the toolbox that's going to save us here. It's going to take a comprehensive approach that includes empathy and de-radicalization where possible, accountability where it's necessary, and true action from our government, from the private sector, and from so many others.
Well, I just want to say that I didn't know a lot about your group until Avi Poster called me and asked me to do this. And I'm really glad I did. I think so many people in my generation felt that we had come so much farther than we have. And it is frightening and it makes you angry. And you wish that that people would recognize it and understand it and do something about it. And what gives me hope is that your courageous move to organize this and to follow through and to try to execute on your goals is a very powerful effort and a hopeful effort. And I think it's good for our country. And I support you. And I as a defender of the First Amendment, a strong defender of the First Amendment, I support what you're doing, and I believe it's one of the many things that we can do to make our country better. So I wish you the best with it. I want to give you the last word.
Well, first, thank you to you, John, and to Reverend Tucker and Sabina, Avi, Deborah, and the whole incredible group of co-sponsors who made tonight possible. I'm just so grateful. We are going to begin to address this crisis by recognizing the crisis, and that starts with education through programming like this, through communities coming together. And so just so grateful to everyone for taking an hour out of their busy lives to learn about this and to engage. It really means the world. And I think particularly when you're steeped in thinking about neo-Nazis 24/7 like we are, it's heartening to get to be in a virtual room like this. It gives us hope and it gives us strength. So it's very meaningful to us. Look, I'll just go back to what I said before, which is that don't let this issue fall off the radar screen. This is a crisis. We are living in a world where the news cycle moves so fast and there's so much happening in all of our lives. Don't let this issue fall off the radar. Hold people to account, whether it be your elected officials, the private sector, and social media companies of which we're consumers. And if you're so inspired, support our work at integrityfirstforamerica.org by helping us bring these Nazis to justice and win the accountability that has been so sorely lacking over the last few years. And really thank you to all of you again.
Tell your friends too.
Yes,
if they didn't
please.
watch tonight, go and tell them what you've heard and pass on the information because it's very important. What were you going to say?
That was it. Please spread the word.
Okay.
You did it better than I could.
Good luck. It's great to meet you, Amy, and I wish you the best. I want to turn it over now to Avi Poster, who's going to close this out. Avi?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us. As John mentioned, my name is Avi. I'm one of those who pestered you repeatedly about joining us tonight, and I'm so glad I did. I'm a proud member of the two local organizations who convened tonight's gathering, the Community Relations Committee of the Nashville Jewish Federation and the Nashville Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. On behalf of both, as well as on behalf of our wonderful co-host partner organizations listed in your invites, thank you for logging on tonight. It is our hope that you will leave this call better informed about the critically important work IFA is doing, as well as optimistic and hopeful about IFA's ability to dismantle the organized network of hate that has infected us. Before saying adieu for the evening, please afford me just a minute or two to share some words of gratitude. First of all, a word about our co-organization hosts. Most of you living in Nashville are familiar with their wonderful body of work. Collectively, our co-hosts fill the largest portion of the heart space in this community. And they do that through their bold and unselfish work serving those with the greatest needs and addressing our most critical social issues. We thank each of you for partnering with us tonight. In addition, please join me in giving loud applause and a special Nashville salute to IFA for its courageous and essential work, in particular to Amy for leading IFA's difficult journey with such great skill and unparalleled conviction. After New York City named Amy its rising star just a few years ago, she has just kept on rising. Know that you can follow IFA's progress in the months ahead. You can read the lawsuit that they have filed in its entirety just by logging on to the IFA website, integrityfirstforamerica.org. And you could also sign up for updates from Amy, and if you're so inclined, volunteer to help IFA move their work forward. Of course, please join me in a loud shout out to one of Nashville's most respected native sons, John Siegenthaler, for lending us his vast journalistic talents and unsurpassed flair and style to guide tonight's conversation, and for adding the majestic Siegenthaler name to our program. John, I can say this with a surety that knowing your dad, as many of us have, he would have been awful proud to know that you were part of tonight's program.
Thank you very much.
Amy and John, we are grateful to you. Before closing, though, let me share one quick announcement. I'd like to invite all of you on this call to come together for another special gathering, the Nashville Jewish Community's annual social justice Passover Seder. Each year we gather several hundred community members to celebrate the story and traditions of Passover, retell its story of the pursuit of freedom. This year's social justice theme for our Seder will focus on issues related to food insecurity and the needs of those among us who struggle just to put food on their plates for themselves and their children. Since we can't gather in person this year, we will gather by what else? Zoom. In lieu of being able to serve you a traditional Passover meal, this year we are partnering with the World Central Kitchen to provide 1,000 meals to MNPS, our school district's families in need. Our Seder will take place on March 11th, 6:30 p.m. Circle the date on your calendar and be on the lookout for a special invite we'll be sending your way. As we are all aware, Nashville is not immune to the deadly viruses of white supremacism and racism, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and all of their sister diseases of hate. Fortunately, we are a city that is not fearful of addressing hate head on. 10 years ago, we stood strong together to beat down awful English only legislation. And the years following, we have stood with and comforted each other when our religious institutions and our cultures have come under attack, or when people who have trouble accepting the differences among us create issues. We have learned that the best defense against the ugly force of hate and intolerance is to link hands and work together as a family, as a human family, as we did in pulling together tonight's program. We are indeed fortunate to have each other to rely on. With this as our last thought, it is actually time to say goodnight. Thank you again for joining us. Nearly 500 signed in, among whom I recognize so many of the most influential and hardworking justice folks in town. It is clear, reading your comments and questions, that we need more conversations like this, knowing that working together, we have the power and influence to truly make a difference. Too often we feel futile in our fight against racism. Thank you, IFA. Thank you, IFA, for bringing us a beacon of light and hope, and for helping us to believe that with courage and dedication to task, something seemingly impossible can indeed be possible. Friends, thanks again for joining tonight. Enjoy the rest of your evening. You'll hear from us soon in a follow-up email about how you could work with IFA. Be comforted knowing that you'll be hearing from us.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Avi. Thanks, Reverend.